Chapter 1 of This Crowded Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Greg Marguerite. This Crowded Earth by Robert Bloch. Chapter 1. Harry Collins, 1997. The telescreen lit up promptly at 8 a.m. Smiling Brad came on with his usual greeting. "Good morning. It's a beautiful day in Chicago." Harry Collins rolled over and twitched off the receiver. "This I doubt," he muttered. He sat up and reached into the closet for his clothing. Visitors, particularly feminine ones, were always exclaiming over the advantages of Harry's apartment. "So convenient," they would say. "Everything's handy, right within reach, and think of all the extra steps you save." Of course, most of them were just being polite and trying to cheer Harry up. They knew damned well that he wasn't living in one room through any choice of his own. The Housing Act was something you just couldn't get around, not in Chicago these days. A bachelor was entitled to one room, no more and no less. And even though Harry was making a speedy buck at the agency, he couldn't hope to beat the regulations. There was only one way to beat them, and that was to get married. Marriage would automatically entitle him to 2 rooms, if he could find them someplace. More than a few of his feminine visitors had hinted at just that, but Harry didn't respond. Marriage was no solution the way he figured it. He knew that he couldn't hope to locate a 2-room apartment any closer than 80 miles away. It was bad enough driving 40 miles to and from work every morning and night without doubling the distance. If he did find a bigger place, that would mean a 3-hour trip each way on one of the commu trains, and the commu trains were murder. The Black Hole of Calcutta on wheels. But then, everything was murder, Harry reflected as he stepped from the toilet to the sink, from the sink to the stove, from the stove to the table. Powdered eggs for breakfast. That was murder, too. But it was a fast, cheap meal, easy to prepare, and the ingredients didn't waste a lot of storage space. The only trouble was, he hated the way they tasted. Harry wished he had time to eat his breakfasts in a restaurant. He could afford the price, but he could not afford to wait in line more than a half an hour or so. His office schedule at the agency started promptly at 10:30, and he didn't get out until 3:30. It was a long, hard 5-hour day. Sometimes he wished he worked in the New Philly area, where a 4-hour day was the rule. But he supposed that wouldn't mean any real savings in time, because he'd have to live further out. What was the population of New Philly now? Something like 63 million, wasn't it? Chicago was much smaller, only 38 million this year. This year? Harry shook his head and took a gulp of the instant tea. Yes, this year the population was 38 million, and the boundaries of the community extended north to what used to be the old Milwaukee and south past Gary. What would it be like next year, and the year following? Lately that question had begun to haunt Harry. He couldn't quite figure out why. After all, it was none of his business, really. He had a good job, security, a nice place just 2 hours from the loop. He even drove his own car. What more could he ask? And why did he have to start the day like this, with a blinding headache? Harry finished his instant tea and considered the matter. Yes, it was beginning again, just as it had on almost every morning for the past month. He'd sit down at the table, eat his usual breakfast, and end up with a headache. Why? It wasn't the food. For a while he'd deliberately varied his diet, but that didn't make any difference, and he'd had the usual monthly checkup not more than 10 days ago, only to be assured that there was nothing wrong with him. Still, the headaches persisted. Every morning when he'd sit down and jerk his head to the left, like this. That was it, jerking his head to the left. It always seemed to trigger the pain, but why? And where had he picked up this habit of jerking his head to the left? Harry didn't know. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 9 now. High time that he got started. He reached over to the inter-department video and dialed the garage downstairs. "Bill," he said, "can you bring my car around to number 3? The tiny face in the handscreen grinned sheepishly. "Mr. Collins, ain't it? Gee, I'm sorry, Mr. Collins. Night crew took on a new man. He must have futzed around with the lists, and I can't find your number." Harry sighed. "It's 1873-5, he said. "Light blue Pax, 2-seater. Do you want the license number, too?" "No, just your parking number. I'll recognize it when I see it. But God only knows what level it's on. That night man really—" "Never mind," Harry interrupted. How soon? 20 minutes or so. Maybe half an hour. Half an hour? I'll be late. Hurry it up. Harry clicked the video and shook his head. Half an hour? Well, you had to expect these things if you wanted to be independent and do your own driving today. If he wanted to work his priority through the office, he could get his application honored on the IC line within a month, but the IC was just another commutrain, and he couldn't take it. Standing and swaying for almost 2 hours, fighting the crowds, battling his way in and out of the sidewalk escalators. Besides, there was always the danger of being crushed. He'd seen an old man trampled to death on a Michigan Boulevard escalator feeder, and he'd never forgotten it. Being afraid was only a partial reason for his reluctance to change. The worst thing for Harry was the thought of all those people. The forced bodily contact, the awareness of smothered breathing, odors, and the crushing confinement of flesh against flesh. It was bad enough in the lines or on the streets. The commutrain was just too much. Yet, as a small boy, Harry could remember the day when he loved such trips. Sitting there looking out of the window as the scenery whirled past. That was always a thrill when you were a kid. How long ago had that been? More than 20 years, wasn't it? Now there weren't any seats and no windows. Which was just as well, probably, because the scenery didn't whirl past any more either. Instead, there was a stop at every station on the line and a constant battle as people jockeyed for position to reach the exit doors in time. No, the car was better. Harry reached for a container in the cabinet and poured out a couple of aspiristamines. That ought to help the headache, at least until he got to the office. Then he could start with the daily quota of yellow jackets. Meanwhile, getting out on the street might help him too. A shame there wasn't a window in this apartment, but then what good would it do, really? All he could see through it would be the next apartment. He shrugged and picked up his coat. 9:30, time to go downstairs. Maybe the car would be located sooner than Bill had promised. After all, he had 9 assistants, and not everybody went to work on this first daylight shift. Harry walked down the hall and punched the elevator button. He looked at the indicator, watched the red band move towards the numeral of this floor, then sweep past it. Full up, he muttered. Oh well. He reached out and touched both sides of the corridor. That was another thing he disliked, these narrow corridors. 2 people could scarcely squeeze past one another without touching. Of course, it did save space to build apartments this way, and space was at a premium, but Harry couldn't get used to it. Now he remembered some of the old buildings that were still around when he was a little boy. The headache seemed to be getting worse instead of better. Harry looked at the indicator above the other elevator entrance. The red band was crawling upward, passing him to stop on 48. That was the top floor. Now it was moving down, down, stopping on 47, 46, 45, 44, 43, and here it was. "Stand back, please," said the tape. Harry did his best to oblige, but there wasn't much room. A good 24 of his upstairs neighbors jammed into the compartment. Harry thought he recognized 1 or 2 of the men, but he couldn't be sure. There were so many people and so many faces. After a while it got so they all seemed to look alike. Yes, and breathed alike, and felt alike when you were squeezed up against them. And you were always being squeezed up against them, wherever you went. And you could smell them, and hear them wheeze and cough, and you went falling down with them into a bottomless pit where your head began to throb, and it was hard to move away from all the heat and pressure. It was hard enough just to keep from screaming. Then the door opened, and Harry was catapulted out into the lobby. The mob behind him pushed and clawed because they were in a hurry. They were always in a hurry these days, and if you got in their way, they'd trample you down like that old man had been trampled down. There was no room for one man in a crowd any more. Harry blinked and shook his head. He gripped the edge of the wall and clung there in an effort to avoid being swept out of the lobby completely. His hands were sticky with perspiration. They slipped off as he slowly inched his way back through the crush of the mob. "Wait for me," he called. "Wait for me, I'm going down." But his voice was lost in the maelstrom of sound, just as his body was lost in the maelstrom of motion. Besides, an automatic elevator cannot hear. It is merely a mechanism that goes up and down, just like other mechanisms that go in and out, or around, and you get caught up in them the way a squirrel gets caught up in a squirrel cage, and you race, and the best you can hope for is to keep up with the machinery. The elevator door clanged shut before Harry could reach it. He waited for another car to arrive, and this time he stood aside as the crowd emerged, then darted in behind them. The car descended to the first garage level, and Harry stood gulping gratefully in the comparative isolation. There weren't more than 10 people accompanying him. He emerged on the ramp, gave his number